resources to the local town next door to us. So you can imagine how far it's taken us that we had to they weren't even allowing us to even have our own banks. So today we live in a time when they continue to claim all of the resources in our territories as their own. And so many of the countries, China, Korea, Britain, everywhere all over the world, countries are buying resources that are coming from indigenous lands without the consent of the indigenous people. And they're being extracted from our lands and removed as our resources. And they hold us as wards. And so Canada holds the position that we're incapable of managing our own affairs. And so they're managing for us as trustees. So they're selling our resources, oil, trees, fish, all these sort of things, supposedly on our behalf. That's how they have things structured within the Indian Act. And no one in the world knows that. But we're held in perpetual state of wardship, like we're children. And we're unable to access our own resources. They also here in this country, in Canada, they claim large portions of our lands as their own, even if they don't have a treaty or there hasn't been an agreement made. So, for example, right now in British Columbia, there's a number of pipelines that are attempted to be being built across indigenous lands. And the indigenous people are against it and are trying to stop it. And Canada sends militarized police in and criminalizes and attacks the indigenous people who have a right on their own land. Even their Canadian courts have acknowledged this is those people's land. It's not Canada's, there's no treaty. The Canadian government disregards that. The current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, he blatantly and openly speaks about how indigenous people do not have a veto right to stop Canadian development across their lands. Like, he just blatantly doesn't even care that he doesn't have a constitutional right to be there or any kind of like agreement or that there's any human rights being violated. Does not care. His father was worse. He was a racist, and you're welcome to look him up. His name was Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and he had a very he had disdain for indigenous people in this country as well. So what we're experiencing is that our lands and resources are being extracted, and we are not being allowed to have freedom, to be free, independent of Canada. And so even when the Geneva Convention, 98 years ago, my people, in a confederacy that we have, political confederacy of other indigenous nations, sent a delegate to what was the League of Nations at the time. His name was Discahe. And 98 years ago, I was reading the notes this morning, thinking about what they were saying 100 years ago now. And it was the same thing that we want our freedom. We want to be independent of Canada. We don't want to be a part of these people, and we never accepted the willingness to join them. Yet today, even in this meeting, we make the reference to the indigenous people of Canada. But that means that we're a part of it. And that's the crux of the problem, is that if the international community seeks to get countries like Canada or the US to change their policies to treat us better, they're set up and structured in a way that they're never going to allow us to have freedom, because freedom means that we take our land with us. And their entire country is based on the premise that it's their land, that they claim our territories as theirs and our resources as theirs. Or that they claim, in the case of Canada, they claim the resources as theirs to access and to sell on our behalf. and that we never get freedom and we never be separate from them. So Deskai came, Levi General, in 98 years ago. I think it was 1921, and he seeked to have a voice at the United Nations. Well, at the time it was the League of Nations, to speak out about what Canada was how Canada was treating us, and Britain pressured the League of Nations to not allow him to have a voice to speak there. So I appreciate being allowed to come here today and being asked to come here today to speak. I think about the efforts that were done 100 years ago, and the same efforts, the same words that he carried then. I wish to push forward that we are people across the country, across the lands here, claimed under Canada, that we simply wish to be peaceful people, free of Canada, to develop our own economies, to develop our own education systems, develop our own governance and our own currencies, and we're being denied that, and we're being treated like as Indigenous people, which means the people of the land, that we're somehow incapable to do so, and that's ridiculous and unfair. So I've been thinking a great deal about what solutions there could be, and I spent a number of years researching those. Currently, I know you're all aware that there are undergoing investigations into murdered children. Canada operated a genocide policy of taking all of our kids from our communities for 100 years, and they put them in these things they called schools, these institutions that they had the church operate, the purpose of them was to strip our languages from our people and to strip our knowledge of our land and our identity, so that we would assimilate into them. When I read the Convention Against Genocide, one of the things that is included as genocide is when you forcibly remove children from one group to another, and that's what they did to us. And they did it for 100 years. So they've created a situation in our nations where we have many people who no longer speak our language, no longer know who their political family lines are or what their cultural responsibilities are. The purpose was to assimilate them. The purpose was to strip our identity from us so that we would become Canadians. In my estimation and my looking at what the Geneva Convention says about genocide, forcing a group to become another group, to join into another group, is an act of genocide. And so by Canada claiming us as theirs, a domestic problem, they are in fact doing that, and they've used the education system, or so-called education system, as a way to do it. And those that wouldn't break, those children that wouldn't conform, they killed them. And so as they're going across the country, I believe there's 130 schools that have to that are currently being investigated, and of those so-called schools, I say that because they found graveyards on these playgrounds. Those aren't schools, and they're unmarked. So they didn't tell the families even their children died. They just didn't come home. And currently there are 6,509, I believe, unmarked graves that have been found. And we know those numbers are going to be considerably higher. And that's not including all the people who've just simply who just disappeared. This is what's been going on in Canada. And the last residential school closed in 1996. In addition to residential schools, they use another kind of school called the Indian Day School. And so those were schools that they established inside our communities. And the kids were sent to those schools and were required to go to those schools. And what Canada hasn't been upfront about is that when they passed the policy and that all of Indigenous children have to go to their schools, although they stopped operating the residential schools, they never stopped the policy that all of our children are required to go to their schools. And so to this day, people are still having to send their children to Canadian public schools or within the Canadian education system, or they utilize what they call a child welfare system to take our children from us. The process of forcing us into assimilation into their system is still ongoing. It's not over. It didn't end. The difference is that our children had to come home at night and sleep in our houses. But that's what's going on. So the Indian day schools were operated in very similar to the residential schools. In fact, I'm an Indian day school survivor. I went to one of those, and with my group of cohort of kids that we grew up with, many of us have struggled with reading and writing because it wasn't the focus. It wasn't the focus to teach us that and to get us strong, educate us. There was always funding formula problems, so they didn't have the financial resources to support the kids. That's what happened. So the reason I'm going into all these sort of things is because what's occurring here in Canada is that they criminalize us for standing up for ourselves. They criminalize us for trying to establish economic systems outside of them. All of the things that the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People all lead towards and spell out that we have the right to develop our own economies, our own governance structures, our own policy, how we're going to govern ourselves, even things like trying to develop our own passports. And to this day, we're having problems because the international community continues to look at us as Canada's Indigenous people, as opposed to just Mohawks or Oneidas or all the different various nations that are here. I believe there's 53 independent autonomous nations within the so-called Canadian borders, and we all have our own territory. Some of our peoples have territories larger than Britain, larger than Italy, and those places are allowed to be considered countries. Yet we're not. So we had a series of meetings with the different Indigenous hereditary leaders, traditional tribal leaders across the country, and we talked about what we need to do. And what came about was that there's a strong belief that we need to have Canada charge the genocide. It's not just about human rights violations. It's about the breach of international law, and that we're supposed to have the right to be free and independent people. And so we believe that charges against Canada for genocide could lead towards our freedom. And some of that freedom means that we need to be able to have our lands independent of Canada. So it's unfair to ask us to continue to be situated in such a way that we're included or a part of the people who have been spent 100 years to try to destroy us, and then expect or think that it's going to be okay that they can apologize and maybe change a little bit of policies, and then we continue to stay as Canadians, because the fact that they made us Canadians is a part of our genocide. So we began to look at what had been done in the past elsewhere in the world, and there was a system that happened after the World War II, where there was a number of countries that had been colonized, or lands that had been colonized by various European nations, Belgium, France, Germany, so on, and they pulled out of those countries. And in those cases, there was an agreement that that country, say France, was leaving, they were going to leave, and that it would create a vacuum, a political nightmare. And so there was they created these land trusts, and they allowed other nations to come in to agree to support them and help them develop their economy and develop their governance structure and provide them with military protection while they did that. An example of that is Israel. Israel was established that way. It was established as a Jewish land trust. And Britain and the United States agreed to be their trustees. So what's unique in our situation here in Canada, the US, and Australia is that all three of those countries separated from Britain. So they're not going to pull out and return back to Britain. They seek to stay. They seek to stay, and they seek to claim all of the wealth and all the resources. So they're never gonna on their own make policy to separate themselves or to give back the land, to give back the resources, because that's the whole reason they're there. And so pressuring them to change some of their policy is not going to equate to them allowing us to have our own banks, or for us to allow us to have our own system of economics, or to participate in international trade independent of them, or any of those sort of things, or to develop our governance structures separate or independent from them. And that's in fact what we need. And so I speak out to the international community today, and I ask that you think about this, that I hope that this plants some seeds that will in the future sprout into an opportunity. That if Canada were to be charged with genocide, that the various indigenous nations who have experienced this genocide would need the political and the financial aid and support to be able to move those agendas forward. We're currently in a situation where we've actually spoke with international lawyers to talk about raising charges against Canada, and they said it might cost us $100,000. But we don't have the financial resources to be able to even come up with $100,000 to move the lawyers forward to submit it in Geneva to begin the process. That's how poor we are, and we're kept that way. Because if we're kept poor, then we're worried about eating, and we're not worried about fighting back for our rights and our lands. And this has been the strategy of Canada for 150 years. In fact, if you Google it, look on the internet, you'll find that Sir John A. Macdonald, the founder of Canada, the first prime minister, he openly said that the key was to starve us. If they could starve us, then we would sign treaties. And so they openly did that, and they ensured that we didn't have access to food and proper health care and proper housing, so that we would be agreeable to give up our lands and our resources in exchange for our life. And today we live in that same situation. My home community, our land is encroached upon all the way around us. There's cities and towns built on our lands. And when we petition the Canadian government to remove the settlers, they refuse. Even when the courts have acknowledged, their own courts have acknowledged that the land is ours and it has been surrendered. And in fact, it's being occupied illegally. The Canadian government refuses to buy out the people or remove them and give us back our lands. And when they attempt to give us back our lands, they do it in a manner where they seek for us to give it to them first, so that it becomes part of Canada. They're not allowing us to be independent of them. And this is the problem. And then they go out in the world and they make business up deals and in agreements with even countries like China, and sell them oil or so on. But they don't have the right to do it. They're doing it. They're hiding the fact that they're holding themselves as the trustees of indigenous people who own those lands, who are adamantly saying, no, we don't want this to happen. So this is a problem. And this is ongoing. This is happening now. I have brothers and sisters and friends who are currently trapped in land disputes where the police are criminalizing them and arresting them and taking them away and forcing them into the court systems simply for saying no and standing in the way of so-called development. So this is the situation that we live in. And these are travesties. I live in a community where we've been actively working at developing our own economies, and we've been developing a cannabis industry and a tobacco industry. And the Canadian government, the provincial government of Ontario has criminalized us. In fact, in where I'm from, many of us, they've blocked us from being able to use the banks. So we can't use banking. We can't get loans to develop our businesses. We can't get loans to, in fact, I was denied to be able to get a loan to even build a house. The government pressures the banks, and then the banks deny us business. And so we can't develop, we can't grow, we can't even get a house. And then they treat us like we're lazy, or that we're poor, or that we're no good. But they've created the scenario so that we are the weakest people, yet we're the owners of the land. So I'd hope to share to the rest of you the idea that maybe we could relook at what they did elsewhere in the world when people were seeking to become free of oppression, and seeking to become free of genocide, and seeking to become free of colonization, and to be creative in a way that will allow us to be able to develop ourselves in accordance to the United Nations rights on indigenous people, and our right as just as people, as a people, to be able to separate and to be able to take our land with us. Many of our nations have great resources and have a great willingness to interact and share in the world, but we're being denied that opportunity. And the international community is likely unwilling or not wanting to put troops on the ground, or to bring peacekeepers into these lands because maybe they think that the countries are too big, or that they're going to fight them, or so on. But we may be able to look at allowing us to use the international banks, maybe allow us to register our lands in an international land trust, and establish ourselves to create new countries, and to allow us to develop ourselves politically, and to have political relations with us, and not be so worried about what Canada or the US or the Australian government has to say about it.
I'm sorry, Mr. Sepp, I do not want to interrupt, but the time of intervention has fulfilled. You have 2 minutes to conclude, if you want. Thank you so much. Sorry for that.
Oh, no problem. This is the thing that I wanted to raise, the issue that was most important in my mind, because it's easy to find out all the reasons, all of the things that what they're hurting us, how they're hurting us, how they're breaking our rights. But it's not so easy to hear our thinking about how a solution. And so I thank you for giving me the opportunity to come to speak today. And I hope that my words are fall on in your minds, and that you're able to do something with them. And I look forward to a future opportunity to speak again. And I'm glad that I was invited to come. And I thank you all very much. I wish all of you a peaceful day, and I look forward to hearing what everybody else has to say. So that's it for me today. Good day. Miawa.
Thank you so much, Seth. I want to say on behalf of the all organizer of this event, thank you for your words. Your words are very valuable for us, because are very, very important, because it's a words of fighters in Canada. Thank you so much once again. Well, after that, I want to give the floor to Hannah Middleton. Hannah Middleton is a human rights defender in Australia. She's a specialist, she's an academic, and of course, a fighter of the human rights. Hannah, welcome. Please open your mic. Okay.
Thank you. I start by acknowledging that I speak from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I acknowledge that this is Aboriginal land, always was, always will be. The movement for Aboriginal land and human rights is strong here in Australia, even while the people are discriminated against, exploited, and oppressed to a high degree. The militant struggle of the Aboriginal people against racism and colonialism, against the denial of their rights, is also an ideological struggle against individualism in support of a collective society based on cooperation, not competition. Today, the movement is centered on demands for what is called a voice to Parliament, trying to find a way to give Aboriginal people a say on the policies and laws that impact their lives, a way to deliver constitutional recognition for Aboriginal people, and a way to ensure that government is better informed in its approach to Aboriginal affairs, to policy and lawmaking. We have to say that this is a large movement at the moment, but there is also an element of cynicism that these are things that we suspect the governments in this country will never give us while we have this kind of society. A second major campaign at the moment is Black Lives Matter, a movement against the deaths of Aborigines, mostly young men, in police and prison custody. Aboriginal people continue to die in our so-called justice system. In the last 30 years, 474 Aboriginal people have died while in police custody or prison. The third major campaign currently is against fracking, and it's in alliance with many environmental groups. 70% of the north of our country, of the continent, is now covered by fracking licenses. Traditional owners and their supporters are waging a prolonged and determined campaign to prevent fracking in order to protect their land and their water. Underlying these three major campaigns currently is the constant demand, which Aborigines have fought for since colonization began in 1788, the demand for their land rights, their right to own and control their land and their resources. And this campaign is more than an issue of civil rights. It goes beyond the democratic aim because it contains a significant aspect, the demand for the return to collective ownership of land, which is such an important means of production. Aboriginal communities and their supporters have been fighting on many fronts in addition to land rights. Much has been achieved, but much more remains to be done, including in support of vastly improved Aboriginal employment, education, health, and housing. Aboriginal people are the proud keepers of what is arguably the oldest continuous culture on our planet. Their heritage spans many different communities, each with its own unique mixture of cultures, customs, and languages. In May 2020, there were an estimated 745,000 Aboriginal people living in Australia, making up about 3% of the country's population. Today, nearly 35% of those people live in major cities. Almost 45% live in regional areas, almost 8% in remote areas, and almost 14% in what are defined as very remote areas. In common with many other countries, the non-Aboriginal population of Australia is aging, while Aboriginal peoples are facing increased growth in the younger age groups. There were approximately 250 Aboriginal languages spoken at the time of colonisation. Today, many Aboriginal people are bilingual, but this pattern varies, with 56% of the people living in remote areas speaking an Aboriginal language, but only 1% in urban centres. Aboriginal communities suffer deep intergenerational trauma, sadness and anger from losing family members. Almost half of all Aboriginal adults report that they or their relatives were members of the so-called stolen generation. The stolen generation are the countless number of Aboriginal children who were forcibly removed from their families from the 1910s to the 1970s under the pretext of child protection. Once children were removed, they were forced to assimilate into white society. This included being forbidden to speak their traditional language or participate in any form of cultural activity and having to adopt new names and identities. Although the stolen generation officially ended in 1969, the practice of removing children continues to this day. Between 2012 and 2017, the number of Aboriginal children placed into what is now called out-of-home care rose to 56% of each 1,000 children. Across the country, many individuals and communities maintain strong connections to their culture, language, and traditional lands. Land rights infuriates the Australian ruling establishment because the demand is for communal, inalienable property. It puts forward a case for the expropriation of private property, which is the basis of our current economy. It creates an alternative to private property and raises the question of social ownership of land and other resources by all the people, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, in a people's Australia. Land rights is the recognition of prior Aboriginal ownership of the entire Australian continent. There must be legislation to return land as communally owned and inalienable property to its traditional owners on the basis of traditional ownership, cultural association, long occupancy, connections, and need. In the short time we have tonight, I want to try and give you a picture of the situation today through some statistics. But I would like you to remember that behind every statistic is a human, man, woman, or child who is struggling with what our society imposes on them at the moment. As with many other figures in this report, matters have changed for the worse as a result of the COVID pandemic. We've just had another national census, and the most recent figures have not yet been published. But we know that Aboriginal unemployment has increased significantly. In 2015, just over half of all Aboriginal people were not employed, compared with 24% of non-Aboriginal Australians. In health, Aboriginal communities have poorer health outcomes compared to their non-Aboriginal counterparts. The experience of colonisation and the long-term effects of being colonised have caused inequalities in Aboriginal health, including physical, social, emotional, and mental health and well-being. In 2012, the average life expectancy of Aboriginal people was approximately 10 years less than that of the non-Aboriginal population. Aboriginal infant and child health is significantly poorer than that of non-Aboriginal infants and children. 37% of Aboriginal children are overweight or obese, with all the medical problems that brings with it. Aboriginal Australians are twice as likely as non-Aboriginal Australians, twice as likely to have a severe or profound disability. Aboriginal Australians are 3 times more likely to be hospitalised for intentional self-harm than other Australians. In 2011, almost 24% of Aboriginal people aged between 20 and 24 had attained a Year 12 or equivalent qualification. However, Aboriginal people aged 15 years and over were still half as likely as non-Aboriginal Australians to have completed school to Year 12. They were also twice as likely to have left school at Year 9 or below. About 35% of all Aboriginal households are living in dwellings that have structural problems, including rising damp, major cracks in floors and walls, major electrical and plumbing problems, and roof defects. 35% of all Aboriginal households. Over 55% of Aboriginal households who are renting mainstream or community housing report that their dwellings have structural problems. Over 55%. In the 2016 census here, almost 1/5 of Aboriginal households lived in dwellings that required 1 or more additional bedrooms. Overcrowding was worse in non-urban areas at 28%, whereas overcrowding in Aboriginal housing in urban areas was 16%. One in 5 Aboriginal women experience physical violence. Aboriginal women are 3 times more likely to experience sexual violence than non-Aboriginal women. And remember, in our society, 1 woman is killed by somebody she knows each week. That's the figure for everybody. It is worse, 3 times worse for Aboriginal women. Aboriginal women are also 23 times more likely to be imprisoned than non-Aboriginal women. Aborigines are perhaps the most incarcerated people on our planet. They are just 3% of the population, but 27% of the total prison population in 2016. In December 2013, the national imprisonment rate for Aboriginal adults was 15 times higher than for non-Aboriginal adults. In Western Australia, they were 20 times more likely to be imprisoned than non-Aborigines. Today, Aboriginal children are 24 times more likely to be locked up in prison than their non-Aboriginal classmates. As I said before, between 1991 and 2021, 474 Aborigines died in custody, and there has been not one single conviction for their deaths. No prison officer, no policeman has ever been convicted. Against this background of constant racism, discrimination, exploitation, and poverty, Aboriginal individuals and communities maintain their resistance and their fight for their culture. I want to end with a quotation from Jackie Huggins, who's chair of the National Congress of Australia's First People. She said, with enormous generosity, "Our motto is a united Australia, one that respects the land and the heritage of its indigenous peoples and provides justice and equity for all." Thank you.
Thank you, Miss Anna Middleton. It's very, very, very values your intervention. Thank you for your speech. And after then, to continue with our programs, I want to give the floor to the comrade, Mr. Kimball Carew from Canada. Kimball Carew is an Indigenous leader of Canada. Kimball, welcome.
Thank you very much. Like Seth, I must say I'm not an Indigenous leader, but an Indigenous activist. And greetings to all the participants in this event. Tanshi, to use the Michif language of my Métis ancestors. And I hope that we all gain some important new understanding from sharing our experiences today. I'm speaking to you from the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish Indigenous peoples of the West Coast, where I live. My Métis family background is pretty common in this country. Some of my ancestors came to Turtle Island, which we call North America, many thousands of years ago. This hemisphere was never a so-called terra nullius, as the church and the European colonizers claimed. This was home to at least 100 million people with distinct languages, cultures, economies, a highly sophisticated knowledge of agriculture, astronomy, and other sciences. The other side of my heritage includes those who came to North America as poor, dispossessed farmers and peasants from northwestern Europe and places like Norway, Ireland, and France. But this was at the expense of the original peoples. The conquest of the Americas saw a mass genocide on a scale unseen in human history. Diseases like smallpox killed a huge part of the indigenous populations, enabling the European colonizers to use firearms to impose their will. Vast territories were simply stolen from the original peoples or taken through treaties in which one side had all the power to dictate the terms and then violate as they wished. In Canada, colonization penetrated from the Atlantic to the Pacific over a period of 300 years. Indigenous peoples suffered mass deaths and even total elimination, such as the Beothuk of present-day Newfoundland. Only small areas of land remained in the hands of the indigenous nations, usually on reserves established through the unfair treaty process. Most of the territory of Canada was declared by the colonizers and then by the modern Canadian capitalist state to be either private property or so-called crown lands under the control of federal and provincial governments. Across the western prairies where my ancestors on both sides lived, indigenous peoples signed a series of treaties from the 1870s to the early 1900s. The chiefs and the other leaders who signed these treaties insisted during the negotiations that their peoples were not surrendering the land. They were agreeing to share these vast lands with the European settlers for the purpose of agriculture. The term that they used was sharing the land to the depth of the tip of a plow. In exchange, the indigenous peoples, under great duress, were to be guaranteed a land base, financial compensation, assistance to begin farming, medicines, education, and other benefits. But the Canadian state simply ignored and lied about the treaty terms. Their intent was always to turn the lands into an arena for capitalist agriculture and industrial expansion. In total, about 3.5 million square kilometers, that's 3.5 million square kilometers, were taken in this area through these so-called treaties, leaving only about 3% of the area to the original inhabitants. On the West Coast, where I live today, most so-called British Columbia, a term that is widely being rejected these days, was never surrendered by the indigenous nations who have lived here for at least 20,000 years. Here, another 700,000 square kilometers was simply occupied by the colonizers without compensation. Huge amounts of land in central and eastern Canada, the areas where Seth is from, were taken in similar ways during the time period from about the 1600s to the early 1800s. The impact of diseases, land dispossession, the destruction of economies, and other aspects of colonization was enormous. Estimates of pre-European contact indigenous population in Canada range from about 350,000 up to 2 million people. By 1867, when Canada formally became independent of Britain, that was down to about 125,000. This loss of population also meant the destruction of cultural practices, languages, knowledge of the land, and much more. I'll give you just one example. During the late 1800s, diseases killed most of the Haida Nation, whose homeland is an island archipelago on the west coast. Their numbers fell from about 7,000 in 1860 to just 829 people 20 years later. Most of the Haida artists and carvers did not survive. This was an actual Holocaust. Canada banned their traditional cultural rituals, notably the potlatch ceremony during this period of time. Starting in 1911, Haida children were subjected to the forced residential school system. As you know, this meant they were taken from their families, put into prison-like institutions where they were not allowed to speak their own languages, forced to learn English, become suitable for employment in the capitalist economy. This was the period when all Indigenous peoples were expected through official Canadian government policy to either die out or assimilate. Either process would eliminate distinct Indigenous nations. The only word for this policy is genocide, either through mass deaths via hunger, poverty, and disease, or through cultural extinction. After Canada became an independent country, Indigenous peoples were prohibited from moving freely off their reserves. They were not allowed to hold public meetings or hire lawyers to argue their legal rights in court. And perhaps most significant, as we said, most children from Indigenous communities were forcibly placed in about 250 so-called residential schools across Canada. Many of the 250,000 children in these institutions suffered from extreme physical and sexual abuse. At least 10,000 died from hunger, disease, physical brutality. The location of thousands of unmarked graves has been revealed in recent months. Fortunately, Indigenous peoples have never accepted this fate. They have resisted in every possible way, from legal and political struggles to nurturing their languages and cultural heritage and opposing capitalist resource extraction on their lands. And some victories have been won through these struggles. A long series of court decisions have recognized and strengthened the legal and treaty rights of Indigenous peoples, for example, to conduct traditional hunting and fishing practices, which go back many thousands of years. The Constitution Act of 1982 explicitly recognizes and affirms the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples of Canada. This act states that no other legislation can take away or supersede these rights. Canada has been compelled to issue formal apologies and financial compensation to victims of the residential school system. Under great political pressure, Canada finally signed the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But governments keep trying to minimize their UNDRIP obligations, and in particular, refusing to recognize the reality of the clauses of UNDRIP that say free, prior, and informed consent must be given to economic development on Indigenous territories. Not should be given, but must be given. The Canadian state still does not recognize that Indigenous nations must have the rights to exercise full self-determination. Canada has also been forced to conduct several inquiries into its genocidal record. This includes the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which in 2015 issued 93 formal calls to action. But most of these have only been partially carried out or not at all. This week, we're having the first annual National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, Thursday, September 30th. This takes place in the context of refusal to carry out most of these calls to action. More recently, the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls documented staggering rates of violence against Indigenous women and girls. The final report issued 231 calls for justice aimed at governments, institutions, social service providers, industries, and all Canadians. But despite such reports, the legacy of colonialism and capitalism continues. Indigenous peoples have remained the most impoverished and oppressed sections of the population in this country. In 2019, the rate of employment for Indigenous peoples was 57%, much lower than 62% for the non-Indigenous population. The average after-tax income for non-Indigenous people in Canada is about $32,000, compared to $22,000, $10,000 lower for those who identify as First Nations. About 1 in 5 Indigenous peoples live in dwellings that require major repairs, compared to 6% of the non-Indigenous population. Mold, bug infestations, inadequate heating, and contaminated water are common problems. Almost 20% of Indigenous people live in overcrowded housing, compared to 8.5% for the rest of the population. Life expectancy is 10 to 15 years shorter. Infant mortality rates are 2 to 4 times higher. Suicide rates among First Nations youth are 5 to 6 times the national average. Almost half of First Nations families do not have enough income to cover their food expenses. Indigenous peoples are 5% of the population in Canada, with over 20% of the total prison population. Since the 1960s, a high number of indigenous people have been placed in care by social agencies, often in non-indigenous homes. Indigenous children are about 7% of all children in Canada, but make up nearly half of all the children in foster care. The federal and provincial governments continue to ignore rulings of courts and human rights commissions, ordering them to provide equal treatment to Indigenous children in the area of foster care, the health system, and education. The colonial and capitalist agenda of genocide and assimilation have met with centuries of resistance here. But as long as the land base remains primarily a source of profits for powerful energy and mining corporations, Indigenous nations will be deprived of the most important material basis to exercise their rights to self-determination. Ultimately, true national liberation and equality for Indigenous peoples within the Canadian state requires building alliances with non-Indigenous peoples who are exploited by the same monopolies. This is a hard struggle, one which requires non-Indigenous peoples to really understand the true history of this country and to accept that Indigenous nations must have the rights to exercise in a full and meaningful way. There's no alternative to this hard struggle. We look forward to continuing to interact with the rest of the international community to explain these facts and to gain your support. And I want to thank you for listening to us today.
Okay, thank you, Kimball Kariu, for your intervention. Very important your words. To continue our program, I will give the floor to the Andy Tien. He is president of the Global Governance Perspective, an NGO from China. Tien, welcome.
Thank you. Good evening, ambassadors and my fellow co-speakers. Thanks for having me with this special event on the protection of human rights of Indigenous people. As you may know, the law school of the University of Nottingham, where I did my own LLM, has a great reputation in the study of international human rights law. Its textbook is popular in the UK law schools. And the human rights course is compulsory for all LLM students. I certainly did not come across any questions relating to the Indigenous people in the exam. Neither did I remember it being taught as a focus at class. Even in the textbook, it only occupies 18 pages within the group rights. So this is just a small example showing the position of the rights of Indigenous people in the whole landscape picture of the system of international human rights law. So why these areas of human rights law so neglected? Let me begin with the history and then to the practice, taking American Indians as an example. And finally, I will give you some recommendations. So first, history. International human rights scholars are surely quite familiar with the so-called International Bill of Human Rights, comprising the UNDR and the two 1966 conventions, ICCPR and ICESCR. However, in addition to the LLO 169 convention, it's only until 2007 that the UN has a declaration on the rights of Indigenous people. In fact, there are talks on the protection of rights of minorities, even in the League of Nations. But why it comes such a long way to reach only a declaration on the protection of human rights of Indigenous people? We need to find an answer in history. As Professor William Shabas, who is a Canadian professor, noted in one of my podcasts, at the very, very beginning, a Chinese diplomat proposed an idea that had originated in Japan in 1919 to have a declaration on racial discrimination in the Charter of the United Nations, but it was dismissed by the United States and the United Kingdom. You know, it was only when African countries joined the United Nations in large numbers that racial discrimination became an important issue. So the reason is very simple, because the US, Canada, Australia have serious problems in protecting rights of indigenous people. So they just blocked it. The reason is just as simple as that. And then I would like to speak about the practice. I'm not a Native American, so I will not give you so much figures, but based on my own research, I would like to show you some phenomena and situations. Over the past few years, America under the rising right-wing populism has been highly controversial. Often described as an inclusive and liberal society, the country was, however, accused of racial discrimination towards immigrants and non-white citizens. From the social injustice in daily life to the practice of offensive investigation and forceful deportation by the government, the abusive treatment of racial minorities has become a major driver of social discontent in the US. Nevertheless, among the gigantic cross-national protests and the civil rights movements, we seem to ignore complaints from perhaps the most recognized racial minority in America, the Native Americans, American Indians. Almost everyone familiar with American history acknowledges that the significant role that Native played in the history of America. Without contributions from the Native, America would not achieve its current prosperity. However, such a group of people with historical virtue faces discrimination, regardless of geographic or community context. Famous experts in criminology and criminal justice, such as Marina Nielsen, suggest one protruding example. The insulting terminology Indian created to describe the Native Americans. Commonly used in American society, the name carries not only inaccurate descriptions, but also inappropriate regions. Worse, the majority of American population seem to regard this name as utterly normal. The Americans hear it in songs, see it in articles, and thus say it in daily conversations. The phenomenon is particularly concerning to me, as the stereotypes of Native people have always impacted how they are treated, extending from an individual level to political, economic, social, and bureaucratic context. In fact, it seems that what's happening to the natives in the US now is a solid justification to the concerns of international community, in which Native American people face the more challenging structural discrimination, in opposed to mere the personal level of discrimination. Scientific reports on major disparities compared to whites in fair treatment by institutions, particularly with healthcare, police, and courts, have been rising dramatically. Excuse me. Parallelly, research suggests that modern forms of discrimination and harassment against Native Americans are systematic and untreated problems. First, Native Americans' individual and collective rights are not fully recognized and protected under either domestic law or international benchmarks. Consequently, the federal government's attention on developing Native life standards and securing their rights fail Famous NGOs such as Gwich in Steering Committee reported increasing federal disregard for indigenous sovereignty in favor of business and competitive interests, contributing to the lack of land rights, forced displacements. The once sacred places for Native Americans are now vandalized by the lack of government protection from business developments. The current implementation of legislation on the Native also faces challenges. Under a mismatch of federal, state, and the tribal levels of jurisdiction, the executive branch faces difficulty prosecuting serious crimes on tribal lands. Levels of rape, sexual violence, the murder among indigenous women are disproportionately high since the criminals faced neglectable obstruction. Federal budgets cuts also severely decreased the natives' ability to access affordable housing, compounded with high poverty and unemployment rates from employment discrimination. The native lack an adequate living standards. Second, this systematic racism towards Native Americans, almost blended in American culture, caused them to live in two conflicting systems of rules, one being their own informal living law, and the other being the formal bureaucratic legal machine. Under the US claim of equality of opportunities and justice for the racial minorities, Native American peoples of past and current conditions strongly contradict these ideas. Native people are among the poorest groups in the country. I will not show you many figures listed in my reports, just one. According to the 2018 US Census Bureau, the median income of American Indian and Alaskan Native households was just above $40,000, much lower than the median incomes of white soldiers. Third, could sorry be panacea? The US government, however, gave weak responses to these pressing social issues. In December 2009, the bill signed by the then President Barack Obama recognized the legal and political relationship between the US and Native American tribes. It claimed to acknowledge the government's official depredations, ill-planned policies, and the breaking of covenants with the natives. The bill also applies for violence, maltreatment, and neglect imposed on Native people. However, it's sorry enough. Acknowledging the issue does not necessarily solve it, and we hardly find any empirical evidence for the government's devotion to securing Native Americans' rights in the past few years. In fact, Obama's successor, along with his administration, has done much harm to the Native community. According to a memo written by the US Committee on Indian Affairs, despite then President Trump advertising his claims to fight for the Indian people, the policies implemented under his administration have done much harm to the Native community instead. I will not quote the statistics figures here. Finally, future, I'd like to give some recommendations. We have heard stories told by our Australian friends, Kenyan friends, those natives, but how to solve those kind of problems. So be aware of these existing problems does not mean the international community could overcome the hurdle of American exceptionalism, the white exceptionalism. Still, I'd like to have some recommendations for the future. 3 recommendations. First, to establish People's Tribunal for the indigenous people. It aims to not only record history, but also pursue accountabilities for all those atrocities, or for all those persecutions, either genocide or other crimes or violence. Second, to set up an international indigenous fund. It aims to raise awareness, promote research, support products, bring real benefits to the indigenous people. Third, culturally, to build indigenous museums by indigenous peoples in Australia, Canada, and the US. It aims to at least to preserve their basic identity. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor Andy Tien, for sharing your experience and knowledge with us. It's are very important. Now we want to move on to the final part of this event, the part of the question, answer, and comments. I want to give the floor to the ambassador of the Democratic Popular Republic of Korea, Mr. Tai Song Han. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. It is great honor and pleasure for my mission to be co-sponsor of this side event on violation of human rights of indigenous people, because nowadays these issues are rather relatively less attended by international community. I also appreciate the panelists for their very detailed presentation, the violation of human rights of the indigenous people case by case with their own experiences, and more importantly, on the legal perspective of what the rights of indigenous people are in the framework, mentioning the fundamental points for just, democratic, and equitable international order. The UN Declaration on the Right of Indigenous People was adopted at the UN General Assembly in 2007. The declaration provides an international framework for the efforts to advance the rights of the indigenous people, and also indicates that indigenous people and individuals are free and equal to all the peoples and individuals, and has the right but not to be discriminated against in the exercise of the right. The declaration contains essential guidance for bringing societies that guarantees the full equality and right of indigenous people. Although we have very clear and definite declaration and other law in this regard, indigenous people around the world have still been suffering from the consequences of historical conquest and the legacies of colonization in their territories. They have distinct culture, identities, and way of life, but are not disproportionately affected by the poverty and marginalization in Europe, who have once colonized many countries. Violation of human rights of indigenous people are rampant in the US, Canada, and Australia, as other panelists clearly mentioned. Those countries are pretending charge of the human rights issue. It is not possible to mention every case of violation, but I'm compelled to mention a few. In US, indigenous people have ignored sovereignty, exploitation of natural resources, minors, identity, poverty, health. In other words, the indigenous people are living like a concentration camp. They are targeted racism, violence against women, sexual abuse, and such things is getting worse and worse. In Canada, domestic policies are still not respectful of right of the indigenous people. In 2021, I mean this year, the discovery of the mass graves with the corpse of minors, original is one of the examples to show what kinds of crimes and violations they committed. When the English settlers arrived in Australia, there are only 400,000 Englishmen compared to 1 million indigenous people. But nowadays, indigenous people represent only 3% of total population. As a victim of the colonial policies, majority of the indigenous people, particularly in the majority of the children, already experienced in prison, violence, abuse, homeless, drug or alcohol abuse at old age. It tells itself that in Australia, indigenous people are most incarcerated in the world. The violation of the human rights of the indigenous people by the US, Australia, and Canada must be stopped at once and forward, strongly condemned internationally. The international community and the UN are the related human rights institutions, including OHR or OHCR, should pay due attention and take proper measures. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. Now I want to give the floor to the president of the Permanent Mission of the Russian Federation, Gusal Kusanova. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and good afternoon, colleagues. At the outset, let me thank the organizers for convening this event on a very important topic and express my mission's appreciation for the very useful information provided by the keynote speakers today. The Russian Federation pays great attention to the topic of indigenous people, as there are 47 of those in our country. Unfortunately, some states, while criticizing others on international arena, are forgetting about the situation in their own countries, where the policy of marginalization and discrimination of indigenous peoples takes place. In this regard, we're expressing our grave concern on the recently revealed evidence of serious deterioration of the status of indigenous people in Canada. Oppression of indigenous people is of systemic nature. The most outrageous issues are increasing number of crimes against women and girls, the practice of forced sterilization, disproportionately high percentage of indigenous people in institutional facilities. We were shocked by the discovery of remains of more than 200 children on the territory of former residential school in Kamloops in British Columbia. The mass graves of indigenous children were forcibly separated from their communities for compulsory assimilation illustrate not the crimes of colonial times, but of relatively recent past. This horrible finding adds even darker colors to the whole picture of oppression of indigenous people, including separation of children from their parents. We call for the proper independent investigation of these revealed crimes and for compensation for victims. Unfortunately, some states, including Canada, often pretend to be human rights champions abroad, neglecting the highly problematic situation in their own countries, where the systemic discrimination of indigenous people still takes place. I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gusal Kusanova, for sharing your opinion and comments and intervention of this important event. Well, we are finalizing with our event, but we have 6 minutes more. If any one of the panelists want to take the floor to the final comments, you have 2 minutes to conclude. I don't know, Hannah, Kimball, Seth, Tien. Only if you have any comment, any final comments.
Sí. Pero
Okay, I'll say.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say in my language, Nyawakoa to everybody who came to this this side meeting. In the past, my nation we had a Venezuelan ambassador to Canada come to our traditional longhouse, and I had an opportunity to speak with him, and we exchanged political work in our nation in Venezuela, and that was a wonderful time. And I see there's some people from Venezuela here, and I wanted to say that I didn't come here with a whole bunch of statistics about what's happening in Canada, because I knew there'd be others that would do so. So I'm very much on the ground working with the people and attuned to what's happening here. And it's true that Canada pretends that it's a champion for human rights, but it tramples ours all over the country. And we desperately need intervention from the international community so that we can change things, what's happening here. And so I'm very glad to see all the different countries and nations of people that are expressing an interest to see what's happening. And we'd hope that there'd be an investigation into genocide into Canada, into the US and into Australia, and particularly look at what relationship or what liability or responsibility the British have and the monarchy, the royal family has in relation to these acts, because there's still a company associated with them. And I would hope that we go past just talking and go past just writing nice words, and to put action to those words so that these situations can change. Because it's not a nice place to live. It's not fair. We didn't leave and go to someone else's land. We don't get the chance to go back home. This is our home. And we're being terrorized in our home by immigrants who came here from all over the world. And they disregard us. It's not fair. Anyways, I don't want to take up a bunch of time. I'm very thankful that I got the opportunity to speak here. It was sort of short notice, and I'm overwhelmed with the amount of work that's happening here to protect people and land and fighting. And so I didn't get the chance to write out a nice speech. I just spoke from my heart what I believe needed to be said. And I hope that I get an opportunity to speak again, and maybe we'll find ourselves with some action. And I would like to be a part of that. So again, Yawakoa, thank you very much. And I wish all of you a peaceful day. That's all I have to say.
Thank you very much, Seth. Thank you for sharing your experience and your struggle. We are with yours in your struggle. So, Hannah.
Yes, just briefly. 3 things. One, thank you very much to the organizers of this event. I think it's important, and we feel privileged to be involved. I would like to say thank you to the other contributors. I feel I've learned much tonight, and I feel a sense of commitment to the future, however difficult that's going to be. The last thing I want to say is, in 1945, at the end of the war, on May the 1st, across the whole of West Australia, Aboriginal workers on sheep and cattle stations went on strike. The owners were flabbergasted. They didn't believe this could be organized. But there's a very famous poem we all know in our movement about the 3 leaders who were called Clancy and Dooley and Don McLeod. And it moves me, but the poem ends, and we keep on fighting, and we keep on coming, and we'll do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you once again, Anna. Thank you for your words are very important. So, Kimbal.
I would just like to thank the other presenters as well, and to say one thing to those of you who are listening here. It's pretty easy these days to Google indigenous resistance and terms like that from Canada when you are trying to find out what's really going on at the grassroots level in this country. Look for the voices of the people who are out in the front lines, the land defenders, the water protectors, those who are really leading the movement to protect the indigenous lands from exploitation and destruction. Don't rely on the mass media from this country or our politicians. Look for the truth yourselves from the people who are actually doing this hard and very important work. Thank you.
Thank you, Kimbal. Now we want to give the floor to David Lopez. He is president of the International Association of the Human Rights and Social Development, IDES. David.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias por darme la palabra. Voy a hacer, I will make the intervention in Spanish. IDES se felicita de este evento, del cual también es partícipe y coautor. Nosotros en el transcurso de este Consejo de Derechos Humanos realizamos un informe en materia de derechos humanos de pueblos indígenas que le fue transmitido a cada una de las misiones permanentes de las Naciones Unidas en Ginebra, y el cual animamos a que puedan tomar conocimiento y les sirva para que sea tomado en cuenta en instancias internacionales como lo pueden ser el Consejo de Derechos Humanos de las Naciones Unidas e incluso la Asamblea General de las Naciones Unidas. Nosotros en nuestro informe quedamos supremamente impresionados con lo que se estudió juiciosamente y descubrimos evidentemente la cantidad de arbitrariedades que se implementan contra los pueblos indígenas en Canadá. Pareciese que al gobierno de Canadá no le importase utilizar sus máquinas empresariales en el exterior para asesinar indígenas en el exterior, sino que también tiene que acabar con los indígenas de su propia patria. Es increíble que nosotros podamos percibir crisis en temas de vivienda, de salud, el tema del extractivismo, derechos a la mujer, violaciones a los derechos del niño, encarcelamientos abusivos sobre indígenas, entre otros. El informe revela una cantidad de datos con cifras bien sustentadas, y por eso animamos a que el gobierno de Canadá implemente verdaderamente políticas concretas que no queden, como lo decía antes Seth y Kimbal, en simples y llanas palabras. Queremos que el gobierno de Canadá cese todo este tipo de políticas colonialistas que han venido a instaurarse desde la época de la colonización europea y que aún quieren mantener para simple y llanamente seguir sometiendo a los pueblos del mundo a un sistema que se ha demostrado con el COVID-19 que ya no va más. Quiero agradecer como presidente de la asociación, al igual que a las otras organizaciones copatrocinadoras y a los países copatrocinadores de la realización de este evento, el cual esperamos llegue a largos alcances y permita que sean escuchadas las voces de aquellas y aquellos panelistas que participaron y hablaron en nombre de sus pueblos en Canadá, Estados Unidos de Norteamérica y Australia. Mil gracias y buena tarde.
Thank you so much, David, for your intervention. I want to remember that this event has been organized by International Association of the Human Rights and Social Development, IDES, Chilean NGO for International Exchange, International Solidarity and Struggle for Peace Committee of Venezuela, Global Governance Institution, European Collective of Equatorian Diversity, and some people are following us from Switzerland, Spain, Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Brazil, Mexico, Cuba, China, Australia, Canada, USA, via Zoom or YouTube. Thank you for all. This is our event, and we conclude with that. Thank you.